Hey folks, I'm Brown Bear. Today I'll be offering my impressions of Northgard, an independent real-time strategy game released in 2017. I picked this game up in early 2020 as part of my goal to play more indie RTS. As I got into it, I found it pretty compelling. I've put around a dozen hours into the game's story mode, and that's what I'll be focusing on today in my commentary. Northgard does have a variety of other game modes, so this is by no means a full review, just my design impressions from playing through the campaign. Right from the start, I liked the way Northgard establishes its setting and lore. The player follows the journey of Rig through the mystical land of Northgard. The story starts out as a simple enough quest to avenge your father, but it quickly snowballs into a larger plot relating to Ragnarok and the end of the world. There's a lot that goes unexplained in the larger story as the player progresses through the campaign, but players can use their imagination to fill in the gaps. In this way, the story of Rig becomes the player's frame of reference toward the broader plot and lore. Instead of trying to think through the implications of the game world as a whole, you focus on what's directly in front of you. I like this approach because it takes a lot of the pressure off of the writers to create a perfectly coherent game world. There's probably a lot about Northgard that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but the game never tries to reconcile itself with a complete backstory. It's a very similar approach to what you see in the Warcraft 3 campaigns, and it's quickly becoming my favorite way of structuring a campaign in this genre. The way that Northgard presents plot progression itself is also pretty smart. Northgard eschews traditional cinematics in favor of slowly panning across high-quality artwork. This will age much better than even the best AAA cinematic. It's also very cheap to produce, crucial for an independent game studio trying to keep costs down. Northgard's actual gameplay features a variety of pretty interesting mechanics. It actually didn't feel like an RTS when I initially played it. I've played other indie RTS games before, and they honestly felt pretty familiar right from the get-go. Part of what plays into this is what feels like an effort to streamline some of the more tedious aspects of starting up a new RTS game. Building is done via a universal build button instead of manually selecting a worker. Workers themselves passively gather food over time and only switch to a different resource if players construct a specialized structure. The happiness system replaces traditional macro management mechanics by providing a passive income of new villagers. You still need to grow your empire and quote-unquote macro if you want to grow into a larger power, but a lot of the mechanical tedium gets stripped away. Really, anytime I see this kind of simplification of core RTS gameplay, I ask myself how the player spends their time in the absence of more traditional mechanics. The answer to this is quite tricky because it depends on the target audience of the game in question. For a lot of RTS players, the rhythmic hundreds of actions per minute we usually associate with competitive gameplay is a completely foreign concept. I've had a chance to watch several novices attempt to play RTS over the years, and what struck me each time was the way they would make a decision and then kind of stop for a few seconds to see how it turned out. It wasn't unusual to see APM in the 20s or 30s. It seems to me that Northgard was designed almost intentionally with this player in mind. I would actually say that its design roots have more in common with Civilization than they do with more traditional RTS. A majority of a player's time is spent panning from tile to tile, ensuring the economic balancing is correct. This also needs to be squared with the long-term planning needed to meet mission objectives or survive through the winter. It's very slow-paced, and designed I think to feel a bit like a management simulator at times. There were moments in my playthrough where I would simply get up out of my chair and do something else for a couple minutes while I waited for resources to come in. This to me actually begs the question as to why this game is an RTS at all. In fact, Northgard's most RTS-y aspects are arguably the weakest part of the package. Unit controls lack basic niceties like using shift to add units to control groups. Box selecting sometimes bugs out. And even simple things like pulling weak units out of a fight feel a lot harder than they do in games released 20 years ago. The universal building button is a good example of a quality of life feature that ends up being more tedious than anything else. Once you start putting down buildings outside of your primary tile, you often need to manually select a villager and task them with building it. It's not exactly a convenience to pan the camera multiple times to do something that in a traditional RTS typically requires just one. None of this is to say that Northgard should become a turn-based game, but as far as the campaign goes, I think the RTS components as implemented detract more than they add to the experience. The build mechanic is the most obvious candidate for improvement, but perhaps even some of the unit control problems could be resolved by moving to a civilization-like battle mechanic. These niceties would free up player time to focus on balancing their economy and deciding which production structure to build next. I think it could create an opportunity for the developers to create even more elaborate economic systems that soak up more of the player's attention. Alrighty, let's talk a little bit about the happiness mechanic. Happiness determines your village's growth rate, and it functions like a rubber band. As your village grows larger, your growth rate goes down until you increase happiness, for example by claiming more territory, upgrading more structures, or researching specific technologies. Each of these in turn becomes increasingly costly over time. Wolves give way to jokers or valkyries, stone mines for upgrades start to run out, and more lore is required to research better stuff. Northgard is thus different from many other strategy games in that your economy never feels like it's growing exponentially bigger. Every new villager slows down growth, every new production structure adds upkeep, and every expansion to a new tile spreads you thinner and forces you to spend more time dealing with raids. To me, one of the most fun aspects of any economic game is watching my town grow from a handful of villagers to a wealthy and massive empire. There are actually times in Northgard where I get the opposite feeling, where I feel richer in the middle of a mission than I do 45 minutes later. Sure, I have more stuff at that point, but I also have a similarly large amount of new costs. I could respect the way that this system works to rein in the scope of player decision making. It is the case that in other games, players can just sit in their base, amass units, and steamroll their computer opponents. Rubber banding the economic play effectively forces players to actually play the game correctly. Indeed, one of the most common threads I saw in my research on this game was some variation of why is the campaign so hard. And this is one of Northgard's most interesting design decisions. As much as it tries to be a very accessible RTS, its campaign is not at all easy. It's pretty straightforward to not win a campaign mission. In the case of Mission 6, Intervention, I had to replay it 3 times before I could win. This stems in part from the decision to layer different growth mechanics on top of each other instead of keeping them separate. For example, happiness trends towards 0 or even negative over time. In order to keep it positive, players need to keep expanding. But expansion itself is interdependent with growth, because players need villagers to collect resources and become military units. In effect, once you stop expanding, you stop growing, and once you stop growing, you can no longer expand. This synergy in growth mechanics creates dichotomous outcomes. If you plan effectively and grow in an intelligent way, you can quickly expand into a healthy and large economy. If you plan poorly, your expansion stops, meaning your growth stops, meaning the next winter will likely kill you. It's very polarizing, and it really reinforces how much the developers want you to take economic management seriously. In this way, Northgard manages to be something of a unicorn. It combines numerous accessibility concessions with an unforgiving gameplay experience. The last thing I'll say here is regarding the winter mechanic. The more I became accustomed to this feature, the more I wondered whether it actually holds the game back. Winter is hard enough that I would often play unnecessarily conservatively to ensure I had proper stockpiles back at home. Aside from needlessly stretching out missions, I again missed the feeling that my village was growing more powerful. This happens often enough in Northgard that I wonder whether it was an intentional decision by the designers. Perhaps they wanted to convey the harshness of the Scandinavian winter, or illustrate how difficult real-life Vikings actually had it. All in all, Northgard is a pretty decent RTS game. It's by no means something I plan to come back to for hundreds of hours, but after playing through the campaign, I feel like I've definitely gotten my money's worth. It's a unique combination of accessibility features intended for the most novice of players, combined with surprisingly unforgiving in-game constraints. I appreciated the challenge of it, even if the pacing was not what I usually go for. I look forward to seeing what the studio will do next in this genre. Alrighty, that's everything for today. Thanks for watching, folks. I'd love it if you followed me on Twitter and Facebook, subscribed to me here on YouTube, and checked out my live streams over on Twitch. All the best, and see you next time.